Well, if we could today, let's jump right into the book of Acts. Chapter 1, beginning at verse 3. It says, Jesus presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. And while staying with them, he ordered them not to depart from Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, "You heard from me. For John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now." These 40 days marked a unique period of time between the fulfillment of the old covenant and the beginning of the new covenant. 40-day periods of time that acted as transition were not uncommon in the move of God on the earth. We see Jesus living his life until about 30, and then we see him being baptized in the river Jordan, and the Spirit of God coming upon him, and the Father saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And then over a 40-day period of time, there was a transition from his life before his ministry. After that 40 days, we see him emerge full of the presence and the power of God. And he went about doing good and healing all those who were afflicted by the enemy. We see the same thing happen in the Old Testament. When the children of God were taken out of slavery. Now, they've not yet stepped into the promised land, but they're out of slavery. And then they have this period of time where God says, "I'm going to come down and speak to you, and I'm going to explain to you how life is supposed to look like for you." And so he called Moses to go on top of the mountain and receive the instructions from God. And so for 40 days, Moses was on top of the mountain. He was receiving from God. He was in the presence of God. But all of the Hebrews, all of the children of God were at the bottom of the mountain. And 40 days apparently was too long for them. They didn't want to wait 40 days. They didn't want to continue doing what they were asked to do while waiting for Moses to return with instructions from God. So they got sloppy in their transition. They got sloppy in their waiting, and they decided that they wanted something that they couldn't have, so they began to take of the gold necklaces and earrings and whatever that they had that they brought from Egypt. And they took their blessing and they put it in a fire pit and they turned it into an idol. And so Moses is on top of the mountain receiving from God, and God says, "You've got to go down because the people have lost their way." So Moses began making his way down to the bottom of the mountain, and when he was almost there, Joshua, his assistant, was with him. And Joshua said, "I hear the sound of war." And Moses said, "No, that's not the sound of war that you hear. That's the sound of something else. There is a sound that should come forth from us when we are waiting on God." See, revival in your house has a sound. God has a sound that he desires to hear from you. And your house either sounds like revival or it doesn't. We know the end of the story. Moses and Joshua get to the bottom and they realize that the children of God have lost their way and they have begun to worship an idol. And Moses broke the tablets. He has this stern conversation with them. And then something extraordinary happened. The transition reset. They had to go back to the beginning. Moses had to go back on top of the mountain. The people had to wait at the bottom of the mountain again. But what we see here in our text is that Jesus stayed with them for these 40 days. And for 40 days, Jesus explained to them the kingdom of God. For 40 days, Jesus was walking them through this process of transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. What I want you to understand about transition, sometimes we push back against it because we hold so dearly to that which is old. And it makes sense to, because please understand, the old covenant was given to them by God. We are told that the old covenant was perfect. Actually, that was the problem. We couldn't live up to it. The old covenant was something that God gave them. And now Jesus is walking them through this process of transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. And what is so fascinating about this to me is that he established these feasts, these celebrations, hundreds and more than 1,000 years prior to this moment when Jesus is walking with them for 40 days. Before he had established these celebrations, where there was one called Passover. We see the fulfillment of that last week when we celebrated Easter. There was the fulfillment of that feast. But then 50 days after that feast, there was to be another one. And that one was called Pentecost. And in God's divine providence, God all by himself, long before the Word ever became flesh, God created, he set up these feasts that would display that one covenant would be completed, and then 50 days later, that another covenant would begin. God already set up that there would be a time period of 50 days where they would be in transition from one covenant to the pouring out of a new covenant. And so Jesus spent 40 days of that period of time walking with the disciples, talking to the disciples, explaining to them things about the kingdom of God that would help them transition from one covenant to another. From one thing that God had done to the new thing that God was doing. And all of us, we find ourselves following God. And God has something new for us, and what has to happen in us before we get to the new thing is a transition from one part, from one place to another. And the transition really is where things, it's where they can get complicated. So the other day, life has been different, I think, for most of us. And this idea of remote working is happening at our house, and remote learning is happening at our house. And so there are a lot of devices connecting to the same modem that they've always connected to. It's just there's a whole lot more pull on the bandwidth than has ever been on that little device. And so the other day I'm in a meeting, and it's a video conference, and it's been going on 20, 30, 40 minutes, whatever, and all of a sudden it started freezing up right when we were getting to the critical pieces, right where we were getting to the part where, okay, we've laid it all out, now we really need to really hone in and focus here and get some work done, and in the middle of that, it just, and it was driving me mad. And all of a sudden, it just locked up. And when it locked up, it was done. My screen went black. I was beyond frustrated. I couldn't get it restarted. Nothing would connect. So I walk out of my makeshift office, which is in the back of my bedroom. I've got a Sam's table set up there. I've got my computer sitting on there. It's pretty awesome. And I go through the house, and this is what I find. This is what I find. Kate is in the kitchen watching a cooking video while she's cooking something. Walt is online doing homework on his laptop, but then he's got a movie streaming on his television. Then I go down into the family room, and Lucy is connected to her work, her schoolwork on one device, and she has a movie playing on another device. And then I go even further, and Claire Bear is in the very bottom of the family room, and she's having a virtual birthday party with Anna and all of her friends. And I realize this is why there's no bandwidth. And so I lost it. I just, not like lost it, but I lost it. I'm like, turn everything off. Every non-essential device, turn it off. There's no cooking channels, there's no movies. And everybody's looking at me like, what's your problem? I mean, they're just in their own little world enjoying themselves, and I come through just turning stuff off. Of course I did. Why? Because it wasn't working. This transition was driving me crazy. And then I remembered the words that one of the kids' principals had put out there. He said, this is not going to be an easy experience. And so I thank you for your patience. And when that runs out, your perseverance. And it was like, okay, yes, perseverance, patience. These are things that become the script of the transition. These are the things that create in us what we need created in the transition, because the person that we were in the old covenant is not the person that we need to be to receive everything of the new covenant. There were promises that were made to us that were based on this better covenant. And so they had to have this transition where they could become the people that God wanted them to be so that they could receive the fullness of what God was promising them. And in order for us to become that person, we have to submit to this process that he's saying is the testing of our faith. James chapter 1, beginning at verse 3 says, you know. So James isn't saying this is like a theological debate, or this is something that we need to discuss, or we need to work out systematic theologies to discuss. He said, this is something you know. You know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that you are mature and complete, not lacking anything. There was a perseverance that the disciples were portraying. There was a testing of their faith that they were submitting to in that 40-day period with Jesus, and in the remaining 10 days that they would be the people that they were supposed to be so that they could receive the fullness of the promise that God had made them. And this concept of perseverance, it's kind of frustrating. I mean, maybe you're an easier going person than I am. I don't know if you can sort of tell through the screen, but I'm not always very patient. And so patience and perseverance, I sort of have to work on those attributes. And so this idea of your faith, faith is the thing that you do because you believe something. But perseverance is the thing you keep doing. Faith is what I do because I believe. Perseverance is me continuing to do it. Because when God makes you a promise, with that promise comes a behavior attached to it, something that you're supposed to do. And then from the time that you believe and begin to do, you have received faith. That now, there's a gap between when the promise is made and when the promise is fulfilled. And we call that gap the transition. And so what is required of us in the gap is perseverance. Perseverance is doing the things at the the end that you were asked to do at the beginning. This is what we didn't see on the mountain with the children of God when Moses was receiving the law for them on top of the mountain. In that 40-day period, they actually fell away. In that 40-day period, they were not persevering. In that 40-day period, as their faith was tested, they fell away. They walked away from what they said they believed. There was no perseverance. Yet we see something quite different with the disciples. Jesus walking with them. Please understand that over that 40-day period, Jesus wasn't with them every day like he was the days before that. He would come in and out. He would be with them and then he would be away. He would be with them and then he would be away. He was transitioning them from being fully 100% dependent on him in the flesh in front of them, speaking to them. He was transitioning them from that to when they would have to rely on the Spirit of God that was going to be poured out upon them on the day of Pentecost. And so they had to persevere in the transition. And this is where we have our biggest opportunity to connect or to disconnect. We just sometimes lose it in the transition. People that say, "Will you marry me?" and somebody answers, they step into a period of engagement. Engagement is not dating. Engagement is not marriage. Engagement is the transition from dating to marriage. 20% of the people that step into that transition never make it to the promise. 20% of the people that say, "Yes, I will," never say, "I do." They fall away from here to here. 70% of people who smoke something, they say, "I don't want to smoke this anymore." 70% of people say, I don't want to do this anymore. I know it's not good for me. I know it costs way too much money. I know it's affecting my life. It's disrupting normalcy for me. I know I need to stop. 70%. 70. And of those 70%, less than half of them, 40%, are able to stop for about a year. And then the numbers drop after that. They want to, they feel like they need to, but the time from smoking something to not smoking something, that transition is difficult. And it's straining them. And we all want it in a moment. We all want it in a day. We don't want to have to deal with multiple days of the same thing. We want everything to be awesome right now. But transitions rarely are. Transitions are the trail that get us from where we were to where we are. And when we talk about it sometimes in faith terms, we make it sound like the transition is almost like a hike or a ski run. Now, when I say ski run, let me explain what I mean by that. Because now in Florida, when we say skiing, I made this mistake a few months ago. I said skiing, you thought I meant water skiing. I meant snow skiing. So there's this thing called a ski run. And there's a lift that takes you to the top of the mountain. And then you take the ski run all the way down to the bottom. It's a trail from where you were to where you are. And that makes it sound like a lot of fun. If I went and did a hike and I walked around something or up something, I would see beautiful sights and I would see nature and I would see animals and it would be awesome. But when you're talking about the road to sobriety or the road to promotion, now when I'm talking about that trail or that transition, now the imagery isn't as beautiful as talking about a ski run getting from here to here. And when the children of Israel had left Egypt and they're at the bottom of a mountain and they were at a place that they'd never been before and they didn't understand why they were there fully and they didn't understand how long they were going to be there and it didn't make full sense to them. It was in that place that they became disgruntled and they fell away during that moment of transition. So I think it's important for us to recognize that when we're talking about transitioning from one thing to another thing, it's not always going to be awesome. It's not always going to be easy. There's going to be patience required, and when that runs out, perseverance. So when the children of Israel then finally came back and they understood what was going on, now it's time to step into the promised land. Everybody's all excited, and Moses was all excited, and then God delivered this communication that was almost like a blow to them. He says in Exodus 23:27, I will make all your enemies turn their backs away from you. Now, that's not saying that he's going to destroy all their enemies. He's saying they're going to turn their back. So they're an enemy, but they're no longer coming at them. Now, rather than being an enemy, they're more like an obstacle. They're just in the way. And then he explains what that's going to mean further. He says, I will not drive them out in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply and overtake you. But little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possess the land. So from the time of the promise to the time of the possession, in that moment, God didn't just go in and remove all of the enemies from the children of Israel. He didn't remove them all. What he said was, I'm going to remove them little by little. Remember that word, little. We have to come to a place where we appreciate the little wins when we're in transition. We have to appreciate the moments that just take us one step incrementally from where we are, just a step closer to where we're going. We have this promise in the New Testament, from glory to glory. We are being transformed. And it wasn't in a moment, it was from glory to glory, from step to step to step to step, little by little by little by little. And when we submit to this process, we find ourselves with a willingness to be transformed or to be renewed over time. And this sometimes can feel like I'm suffering through this. And here's a word that when we introduce it, if we are people of faith, that word has sometimes been abused in religious or gospel conversations. And so people of faith like to take that word back and put it in its context, so we don't make it sound like there is all suffering that is suffering with Christ. So if I can give me about 5 minutes to just walk us through a way to think about suffering, because suffering is something that it says that Jesus did. Suffering is something that we're told we have to do. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, the Apostle Paul said very, very clearly, if you are children of God, then heirs. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Jesus Christ, provided that you suffer with him, that you also may be glorified with him. And then he said, I suppose that the suffering of this present time is not comparable to the glory that will be revealed to us. And so he's laying this out, that in following God, there will be periods of time where when you make a decision to obey God, or you make a decision to follow God, not in every following, not in every moment, but in some of them, there will be this attachment of what you might consider suffering. So if God says, I need this out of your life, and you say, okay, I'm putting this out of my life. When you remove that from your life, that distance, that separation will create some anxiety. That distance and that separation will create some frustration. When you go from darkness to light, sometimes letting go of the things that hang on is hard. And there is emotional suffering in that. There's sometimes there's relationships that suffer because of that. When God says, you know, this isn't best for you, and so you say, I'm not going to do that anymore. There are friends that you have that every time y'all got together, this is what you did. And now when you say, I'm not doing this anymore, now all of a sudden the friend group kind of absorbs your space or fills it in with someone else, and now you're left out. Why? Because you're no longer doing the things that you used to do. Why aren't you doing them? The only reason why you're not doing them is because the gospel of God comes in and says, that's not good for you. You need to let that go. The only reason why you are experiencing that loss of friendship and that loss of that thing to do is simply because you're following Jesus. That's the only reason. When the gospel talks about suffering with Jesus, we're not talking about the things that everyone suffers. All of us, saint and sinner alike, suffer loss of people that we love. People whom we love die sometimes before they should. Sometimes they die at a ripe old age. Regardless, we all suffer the loss of people, whether we're following Jesus or whether we're not following Jesus. Sometimes economies crash, and everybody in that particular field, everybody lost their job. It wasn't unique to those who were serving Jesus. It was just loss, utter loss, because an economy crashed. That isn't suffering with Jesus. But what if God says, I want you to walk away from that job because I have something for you over here? And you give that job up, and you walk away from that job, and you step into something else, and there's a gap from the pay that you had at this job and the pay that's at this job. That is a suffering that is because you followed God. But what we need to understand is the suffering that comes from following Jesus is rewarded or responded by God as a reward on the backside. So it's only a temporary, it's only a season that we don't have something. It's only in the transition that we give this up, because there is a glory that will be revealed to us on the back end. And when some of us, we go into the decision realizing this might cost me something for a little while, but there's great glory on the backside. There is a willingness to persevere because God made me a promise, and I know that God is faithful and that God will always do, and He will always fulfill what He promised. And so even in a moment, if it's not what I want or what I thought it was going to be, I know I persevere. My faith remains strong because I'm headed towards the promise. The Hebrew children gave up. That generation, little by little by little by little, they never stepped into the promised land, ever. The testing of their faith, they never won. They never, ever won. They never let perseverance have its final work, that they might be mature and complete, not lacking anything. They were a generation that believed God enough to step out of slavery, but they didn't believe Him enough to step into the promised land. Where did they fall off? In transition. They fell off in transition. Jesus likened this a little bit to childbirth. In John chapter 16 and verse 21, let me talk about something for a minute that I know absolutely nothing about. Absolutely nothing. He said, a woman who is giving birth, she has great sorrow, for her hour has come. She has great sorrow. That would be suffering, that would be anguish. She has great sorrow because her hour has come. However, when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a child has been born into the world. So there was a transition from pregnancy to parenting that brought great anguish and sorrow, but she didn't remember the sorrow of the transition from pregnancy to parenting because of the great joy of the fulfilled promise, which was a child that was sitting in her lap that God says is yours. And what if she gave up along the way? Paul said it like this in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 19. He said, my little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth. The anguish of childbirth. Until Jesus is fully formed in you. So what Paul is saying is, there is an anguish in raising children. These were spiritual children. And along the way, he would find them being deceived by one thing or running after another thing. And so he would literally pray. He would literally go speak to them. He would literally debate and argue and be mocked and be fussed at. And he would endure this suffering while he was in anguish of childbirth because he wanted to see Jesus formed in them. This is something, this should be encouraging to every parent out there. My oldest brother would have been in kindergarten in like 1974. And Junior, I'm sorry for every word that's about to come out of my mouth. He was terrible. Like, he was an awful kid. He says he wasn't, it's a lie. He was terrible. He actually, in kindergarten in 1974, the teacher tried to cast the devil out of him. Who, at the age of 5, has the devil cast out of him? Okay, so keep that, 1974. We're holding that number. Now let's fast forward to 1992. I'm a senior in high school. I had passed out at a friend's house. I got up at 7 in the morning. I'm racing home so that I get home before my parents realize that I never made it home. And on my way, I pass my little brother on the road who's on his way to Saturday school. That was 92. I finally graduated. My little brother, he graduated in like 96, 97, somewhere in there. He was just as terrible the whole time. So the way that I got it figured is from 1974 until 1997, are you hearing me? 23 years, my parents were in the anguish of childbirth. They were standing for their children. They were interceding for their children, but there was suffering along the way that they were willing to persevere and they were willing to endure, because more important than just having kids was having kids in whom Jesus Christ was fully formed within. And so we don't give up just because they turn 18, or we don't give up just because they're 16. We can pull back from that when we have placed them in a moment where they are fully formed, where Jesus is fully formed in them. And look, it will take perseverance to get there. There's a transition, 20 plus years of transition, getting them from where they were to where God wants them to be. So are we willing to submit to this process? Are we willing to do the things that God is calling us to do in this process? Please understand, right now, you are where you are and I am where I am. This is not the new normal. I get so tired of these stupid articles that I read that like, this is the new normal, church is going digital. No, it's not. The entire definition of church is a gathering of people who love and serve God. Let me just assure you of something. We are not only doing our best to capture this moment so that we can bring the glory of God to your household, but we're also doing work in this place and getting it ready so that when the moment comes, we're all going to be back together again. But what I do believe is that the work that God is doing on the inside of us in this transition, when we come back, we will come back stronger. We will come back more unified. We will come back more desiring to be in the presence of God. And we will not relent and we will not stop until we receive the fullness of everything that God has for us in every moment, in every service. See, I believe that this isn't the new normal, but what this is a transition moment. I do not believe that God will waste this moment. When the entire world gets shut down and gets put in our homes, all of a sudden there is opportunity for the Spirit of God to step in you and through you to your household and make a difference in your house that quite frankly always needed to be made. But we just have a greater opportunity to make it than we've ever had to make it before. So we absolutely believe that God is moving. We absolutely believe that God is working. I got so frustrated the other day. There was a governor, and they were asking him about all that was going on because the news that they were giving was better news than they thought that it was going to be. And this governor says, I want you to know something. The news is better because people have done what they were supposed to do. This isn't better because God did anything. And when he said that, it wasn't just anger in me. It was like, God, please hear me. We see what you're doing. We give you glory for what you're doing. We know it could have been worse, but it's actually better than anybody imagined because we believe that you heard the cry of your people and you are moving on our behalf. See, I want you to realize that before these moments, there were all these models that everybody was putting out. And Dr. Burks, she's like one of the, if you're not paying attention to the news, she's a name you might hear. She's like, genius. She is leading a collection of very smart people, and they follow all these models, and Dr. Fauci, they follow all these models. And what they said to us weeks ago was this: if we do everything well, and then she actually corrected herself on the Today Show. She said, if we do everything well, I mean perfectly, if we basically do everything perfectly, the best case scenario is 100,000 people will lose their life. 100 to 200,000 would lose their life. If we don't do it perfectly, it could be as high as 2 million. Now, at that point, please understand that the church who loves Jesus and loves its neighbor, the church has been on its face. The church has been making changes. The church has been submitting to God in the transition, not just here, but every church all across our land, interceding on behalf of our people. And they just threw out a group of numbers that they now said it's going to look more like 60,000, almost half of what they projected. And they come back and they say, oh, that's not God. That's just because we've done everything we were supposed to do. Please understand. I just want to be, if I'm the only one, that's fine. Some little preacher in Lakeland, Florida, if I'm the only guy, that's fine. But please understand, they said if we do everything perfectly, it's 100,000. And then the church got on its knees. And now they're saying 60,000. And that number could go down. Anything above 0 is terrible. But I want you to know 60,000 is better than 100,000 because God moved on our behalf. Because God is moving on our behalf. You can't control for a miracle. You can't figure out what's going to happen because of a miracle. Egypt could not prepare for a miracle. God opened the Red Sea. It was a miracle. Jericho couldn't prepare for the walls falling down. Death and hell couldn't prepare for a resurrection. So there's not a model that can predict a miracle, but the model made its prediction, and then the church did its praying, and now all of a sudden we see what we see, and I give God glory for it. I thank everybody for the work that they've done, but I also thank Jesus and glorify Jesus for what only Jesus has done on behalf of our people and our nation and our city. So it absolutely is God moving. 100%. So in this transition, what becomes most important? We let go of the things that God says we let go of, and we pick up the things that God says pick up so that we are the people that He is preparing us to be for what He's about to do in and among us. This is what they did in the New Testament. This is what they did when Jesus said, you go wait. It said that they were all together in one place and they prayed. They were one and they prayed. They also made adjustments to their team. They also made adjustments to their lifestyle. See, Judas was one that was ministering with them. I know we give Judas a bad name, and we should. The son of perdition, nothing good. But I do want us to understand that he was one of the 70 who would go out when Jesus would send them out, and he would lay hands on the sick and they would recover, and he would cast out devils and devils would come out. He was one of the ones who walked with Jesus. And so there was relationship between the disciples and Judas. We look at it from the very end of the story, but they took it from the beginning. They had relationship with him. When Judas was complaining about all that the lady was pouring out on Jesus, please understand the rest of the disciples, they were complaining too. And now Judas hung himself. And he's with them no more. And now what? What to do? Jesus is actually gone. Now we're at the 10-day period from the time Jesus left to before the promise was poured out. What were they doing? What was their waiting looking like? They weren't vegging on carnality in the world. They were in the Gospels. They were in the Word. They were coming and finding what it was that God was telling them to do. And Psalm chapter 69, verse 25 says, may his place become a desolation. So they knew that what had been taken away needed to be removed, needed to remain away. They needed to forget about the past. They needed to forget about what had been stripped away. It needed to remain a desolation. They didn't need to go create a memorial for Judas. It would remain a desolation. There are things during this time that have been taken away from you because they're just not available anymore, and some of those things you need to let remain. You need to let them remain away. Not everything that you have given up in this transition do you need to bring back. There are some things that you have released, some things that you have let go, some habits that you have quit simply because they were taken away. Leave them away and may they become a desolation. But then, Psalm 109 verse 8, speaking of Judas, said, may his days be few and let another take his place. So what they let go of, there were some things, they now need to take something and replace it. What you let go of, what carnality you let go of, what the flesh you let go of, what sin you walk away from, there is something of righteousness that you need to pick back up. There's something of righteousness that needs to take its place because you have room now. Right now, some of you have more time than you have had. And in this having more time than you've had, you've picked up some good habits. You are praying more. You're reading your Bible more. You're consuming more of the gospel. Could I just say, could you just keep on doing that? Whenever we reach that new place, whenever we reach the now season and we're out of this transition, when we get there, could you remain those gospel tactics that you have brought to your life? Could you keep up with them? Keep up with them. So in that period of time, they let some things become a desolation. But then it said, let another take his place. What did they take the place of? Ministry and apostleship. They needed another one who would minister. They needed another one who would be an apostle. Maybe they didn't need 11 so that one person had a higher value to their vote. They needed 12 so that they could have conversations where everything was equal. I'm not sure why there needed to be 12. But the gospel said that when this happens and one is taken away, let another take his place. So they lived according to the gospel. Maybe they didn't want to put a 12th person. Maybe they didn't want another. Maybe they just wanted to let it go. But the gospel said, no, you have to bring on another. There has to be 12. And they followed the gospel of God. This is what we do in transition. We seek him. We find him. We let him refine us. We let him renew us. We let him transform us little by little by little. And when they'd done all of that, and they reached that point in time that God had declared, it said, suddenly there came from heaven the sound of a rushing mighty wind. Remember at the beginning, Joshua said it's the sound of war. Moses said, no, that's a different sound. Revival has a sound. There should be a sound coming from you during this season of transition that precedes the sound of heaven. There should be a sound that is coming from you, a conversation that is coming from you, a declaration that is coming from you, prophecy that is coming from you, prayer that is coming from you. There should be a sound of revival coming from you in your household that will set up, that will lead you into the sound of a rushing mighty wind when God decides that he's going to move and pour out upon you. We've always seen it happen this way. There's always been a sound of man that preceded the move of God because people decided to do exactly what God called them to do. What does your house sound like? What does it sound like? They prayed. They prayed. They prayed. And when they had prayed, suddenly there came the sound of a rushing, mighty wind, and the fire of God sat upon each and every single one of them. There have been some of us that we have not experienced the fire of God because we've not put ourselves in a place where God has called us to be. Some of us, we've not put ourselves in that upper room. Some of us haven't bowed our knees as we've been called to bow. But I'm telling you, there's a sound from heaven like a rushing mighty wind that is coming. And there is a fire of God that is coming. And you need to be ready for what God is going to pour out upon you. And now is the time, and now is the hour, and this is that moment of transition where you get it right. This is that moment of transition where you submit your life, because I hear the sound, and the fire of God will follow in the name of Jesus.
Stir it up, fan the flame, stir it up, stir it up, fan the flame, stir it up, stir it up. Stir it up, stir it up.